Ahoy! I've been struggling to find an effective Mirage build because a lot of builds that were available so far were purely gun builds or purely spirit builds, and I don't think Mirage excels at either of those things for a variety of reasons that we can briefly talk about. So I was trying to come up with a build that you can search up. If you look for SLOTH on the public builds, then it will come up. I have published it, so you can check that out for yourself, and I want to explain that. I want to talk about my line of thinking here and why I think this could work. So the first thing that I think with Mirage is a bit of a problem is that he has very low gun DPS to start with. He has the lowest DPS in the game at 51, and if we go to max level, then you can see it is 91, which is not the lowest. Haze, for example, has lower DPS, but she has various ways to make up for that. So pure gun damage on this character so far didn't feel good to me. If you're good enough at aiming and you just outclass your opponents, sure, it's effective, but I thought that didn't really work well. Likewise, pure spirit damage felt fairly limited. If we look at the abilities, Tornado has a little bit of damage, has a little bit of scaling, not anything crazy though, not even enough to proc Mystic Burst here by itself. Fire Scarabs is very important, doesn't actually deal spirit damage, it's a health steal, so it doesn't proc a variety of effects or benefit from a variety of effects. It doesn't proc Mystic Burst, for example, it doesn't benefit from any spirit vulnerability, and various other effects that are just irrelevant for it, meaning this is not quite as strong in terms of burst potential as it would be if it had that normal spirit damage scaling. And then of course you have Jin's Mark, which has the highest spirit damage in the kit because you are trying to consistently get those stacks up and then the multiplier increases, and that is where your damage is coming from. But obviously that by itself isn't really enough to have consistent spirit damage. So you need to find other means to get that damage, and from the ult we're also not getting any damage either. And one thing that I think is very effective about this character is the Tornado. It lifts enemies up in the air and we can actually increase the duration of that, and this lift is just incredibly potent. It's almost like a mini Wraith ult, and it's very, very quick because you can just go in and you can whack the enemy, you can shoot them, whatever you want to do. And I felt immediately after using this just once that this was something that was setting up a heavy melee attack. And I also want to show you something, because high levels of play that may not be as easily done. You can also very easily bait out a parry and then charge into the Neo and still do the melee afterwards, and this is without any duration increases. It's way easier with duration increases. So very, very effective tool to set up melee, either with a bait or without it. And I think that is one of the places where this character really shines, especially because the rest of the kit also kind of lends itself to getting into close combat with a health steal, with a slow that you get when applying effects here, and with teleporting on top of enemies or close to enemies. So now, with that out of the way, let's talk about what we're actually getting. Our first item is going to be Ammo Scavenger. This can be replaced with Extra Spirit if you're not in a duo lane. I find that Ammo Scavenger is still very effective in a solo lane, but in a duo lane where you're kind of competing more over the last hits with your ally, which is not a bad thing, but in that case, I feel like Ammo Scavenger does not feel quite as effective. Second is going to be a Close Quarters. This is setting us up for Point Blank later on. Now there are other weapon options that people will definitely like on him, like Headshot Booster, for example, is very, very nice. Restorative Shot is also very nice. For this particular build, we're going for a lot of yellow tier 2s, so we're skipping any further options here so we can progress into mid-game quicker. For Sustain, we are usually getting melee lifesteal because it also gives us that extra melee damage, which we need for engages with our first ability. Then we're also getting Spirit Strike. This is somewhat optional, but I think the melee damage increase is also nice. And we're getting some Spirit Resist reduction from that, meaning we don't need to opt into as much in other ways later, which we would have to spend more on, which again is not that effective because Fire Scarabs doesn't benefit from it. We're getting Sprint Boots for early mobility and sustain. And we are usually, optionally, getting extra stamina because I feel like this character benefits from having a little bit more movement potential through that. You don't have to do that, but I really like it. What's optional for laning, always Monster Rounds, extremely strong item, but I think, again, we need the yellow slot, so I would generally avoid it. And if you want to have a bit more sustain and a bit more spirit power as well, then you can get Enduring Spirit. You're not going to get all too much out of the Spirit lifesteal here, though, because, again, you're not dealing that much spirit damage, so it's relatively minor. I'm not the biggest fan. You could also go for Exo Region or something. A lot of flexibility here, really up to you, but if you don't feel like you need a 4th green item, you can also skip that for now. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Then we get into the early game stage when the initial laning is over. Here we're going into melee charge because we obviously want to get as much possible out of our heavy melee attack. And also with the way this works since this patch, it actually can overstack on bullets. So if I hit an enemy while at full bullets, you can see that I'm now sitting at 32 bullets, which means you will very, very rarely need to actually reload, as long as you very occasionally chuck in a heavy melee on a minion here and there, or a jungle camp, or an enemy player, because you will just have this doubled mag most of the time, or not doubled, but like increased mag most of the time. So that, I think, is extremely effective for keeping your ammo up and also still utilizing your heavy attacks in an aggressive way. Duration extender, you can already see here the long list of things this affects. It's just extremely good on this character because we have the lift duration being increased on our first ability. We have various buffs being increased. You have the steals from the second ability increased. So really so much happening here that I would not see any reason not to build this. Usually probably not looking for the upgrade though. I think the first version here will be fine in the vast majority of situations. Mystic Shot gives us another avenue of spirit damage, which I think is very nice because he doesn't have that much. Also received a scaling buff this patch, so everything else we build in terms of spirit damage kind of fits in nicely with that. And also obviously gives us a decent amount of extra weapon damage, which we are going to want. Then we have Suppressor, which I think is very effective to even out trades a little bit more. Again, this character does not have the best base bullet damage or anything, and it kind of takes a while to reach full effectiveness, in my opinion. And this can kind of offset the difference here, in my opinion, because you are reducing the enemy's fire rate by 25%. And also, this is setting up Mystic Slow at some point later. And then you have the option here to go into Soul Shredder bullets. You can do this if you are feeling like you're not going to effectively utilize Kinetic Dash, then you should do this. The problem is, once again, the Spirit Amp here doesn't work on Fire Scarabs. So choose for yourself if that is worth it to you. I would get it in some games because I think the Spirit Lifesteal is nice, but you're also not getting that much out of that. So yeah, up to you. It has a bit more weapon damage as well. So there are some factors to consider here. But if you feel comfortable using Kinetic Dash and you are using it often enough for it to be effective, then I would recommend going for Kinetic Dash instead. You're keeping close quarters, so you kind of have to choose between the two here. I will recommend this most of the time. If you have an early flex slot, we're going to just enable flex slots in this case. Then you can go for improved cooldown, but the rest of the build, it does not immediately assume that you will have this flex slot. So that's just if you do. I put Bullet and Spirit Armor here next. In my opinion, in most games with Mirage, you will probably want at least one of them, and probably also the upgrade. Do this whenever you feel the need to get it. It's just entirely situational. You have one slot open here at any point to at least get one of them in, and then if you have a flex slot, you can get the other one in. Again, very flexible. The general mid-item order is also somewhat flexible, and Echo Shot here is a bit optional, but a very strong tool in some situations. So we are kind of shifting somewhat away from melee. We have one melee item here still, but Point Blank will indirectly benefit our melee anyways. So overall, just a strong item with a slow applied to it as well. And then the only melee focus item that we're still getting at this point is Life Strike. This is also not super strictly necessary. If you feel like you need both armors, you don't have flex slots, and you want to sell melee lifesteal instead, that's also completely fine. But if you think at this point you can still utilize your melee effectively and play aggressively with that, then obviously there's a benefit here. We have another slow applied, so consider that we have a slow here, we have a slow here, and we can later on get another slow with Mystic Slow, and we can get a slow from our third ability. We are just constantly slowing enemies, being an absolute nuisance with that, and that's great. That's kind of like a Calvin playstyle almost, but a bit more consistent and not so much focused on one or two abilities. Then we're getting Enduring Speed. You can also get that earlier. It's just one of those things. Fit it in whenever you need it. The movement speed obviously is extremely valuable for quick rotations, especially with the map now being bigger. And then we have Echo Shot. So the reason why Echo Shot is really cool on this character in particular is because you can utilize this with your first ability. So I can go in on someone, I can melee them, I can use Echo Shot, and I can go on them again, and I can do another melee. You get the idea. Very straightforward and very, very effective in order to disrupt even multiple enemies at once. If you are beefy enough at that point to be able to go in like that, and you're ahead enough, then you can very much make use of this. If you're not ahead enough, if you're feeling like you're getting pressured out too much, then probably not worth it, because it's obviously a very expensive item. We're going to sell it for now. We're going to assume you're not getting it. We're going to say, okay, we're just going for the safe route here. We're going for improved spirit. If earlier on you didn't buy ammo scavenger and you bought extra spirit, then this is going to be a little bit cheaper as a pathway as well. And that brings us to late game. Here we have Mystic Slow. Again, fire rate reduction is going to be very effective along with the normal slow, because we are not really able to take trades against late game carries with this build, and with, in my opinion, most weapon focused builds, because he just doesn't quite have the same baseline as most other characters when it comes to DPS. Again, Haze is lower, for example, but her fixation damage is so much higher than Jin's Mark in comparison, that she doesn't really need a higher base DPS. So yeah, I think Mystic Slow can somewhat offset that, and it's very easy to apply. Target just needs to take some form of spirit damage, so if you're engaging with a 1, that's already going to happen anyways. And that brings us into like real late game territory, where everything is very optional, like Mystic Slow included. But for example, you could go for superior cooldown, and you could probably like put this on your 1, but I would generally put this on the ultimate. Divinous Kevlar is extremely good, because every time you're using your ult, you're getting this effect. What can I say? You're getting massive shields and spirit power. Really nice, really nice to have. Superior Stamina if you need it, self-explanatory. And Spiritual Overflow if you're going to have a little bit more fire rate, more gun damage here, but also a little bit more cooldown reduction, everything, along with the stacking passive. You're constantly shooting enemy heroes with bullets anyways with this playstyle, because you need that to stack the Jin's Mark. So why not, really? It just gives you a bit of everything you want. And then I put Inhibitor here as the last item. If you're getting to this point and you're feeling like, okay, I just need more utility, I need to be more tanky, I need to sell something, say at this point we don't need ammo scavenger anymore, for example, then we can throw in an inhibitor here. That will give us even more utility against the enemies, even more damage reduction on their side, and even more slows. You're kind of overstacking on slows at this point, but it's fine. Like, you're going to proc one or the other most of the time, pretty much. And that's the whole idea, right? You want to just be an absolute nuisance at the point where trading is getting worse. Because in my opinion, he does not do that well in very late, because his ult is just not as useful. Sure, you can teleport behind the enemies, but compared to a Dynamo ult or something, you just don't have that big amount of utility from the ult that many other characters get, or the same amount of burst either. You're kind of more reliant on your base kit, which is good, but not good enough to carry late game alone, I would say, unless you are just completely outskilling the enemy. Let's look at the leveling order now. If you want to play very, very aggressive, you can level the Tornado on level 1, for example, in a dual lane. If you just want to hard engage on the enemy right away with some setup, with certain hero combinations, that is possible. If you want to have more of a bit of a safe tool that gives them a little bit more pressure through poking, then you want to start with Jin's Mark. I think in most soul lanes you'll do that. There's not much of a point in starting with the Fire Scarabs, in my opinion, but I will show you in a second why that is. Because if we put in our first point here, we unlock Jin's Mark. Then our second point is also an ability unlock, and after that we get our ability points. So what you want to do is you want to unlock Jin's Mark, and then either unlock Tornado or Fire Scarabs. That's completely flexible, because then you can immediately put a point into Fire Scarabs if you're leveling it, which gives you the 15 seconds cooldown reduction, which makes it a lot more effective for any kind of poking. Tornado only really gets the same effectiveness after 3 points in it, or like 2 level ups. So yeah, it's more a very hard engage tool rather than the consistent damage that you could get from Fire Scarabs, which in my opinion is not super great in the laning phase anyways. So we're going to do the more traditional road here. We're going to go for Jin's Mark, and you can get that 1 point in Tornado right now if you want to. Yeah, it just gives you that lift duration, so it's pretty much a why not point. It's good anyways. And then next we can level Fire Scarabs, and after that I would also put a point into it immediately, so that you have access to the reduced cooldown. Next you will be able to level up your ult, or unlock your ult, and then you can use the next points to level up your Tornado. This cuts down the cooldown significantly, makes it a lot more effective, and that's basically the baseline for what we want to have in terms of abilities. After that, it depends a lot on your playstyle. I think increasing the multiplier on Jin's Mark really increases its effectiveness, so that is usually what I aim for. So I'm going to get 2 points into that, and then we can put 1 point here into Travel as well, into the ultimate for the 20 seconds cooldown reduction. I think that is usable often enough for it to be effective, but you can also skip that a little bit later. It's not a force point at all. Then I put the last point into Jin's Mark, but you can also put it into Tornado if you want to have that early bullet evasion. If you are able to go in aggressively frequently, absolutely a good choice. If it's a match where you feel like you have to play a little bit more conservative, a little bit more to the back, then I would try and get this, because you can stack your marks more quickly since there is 0.5 seconds less between the multipliers. After that, again, very flexible. You can max out Tornado first. You can say I'm going to wait, or you can max out the Fire Scarabs for an increased max health steal. Both perfectly fine, perfectly viable. In this case, we're going to do the Fire Scarabs and then the Tornado, but really both works, and you could definitely argue that the Tornado can increase your survivability more in many situations because of the bullet evasion versus the direct steal. It depends on how many enemies are around you. So yeah, very, very flexible. I like the kill secure potential that you have with more Fire Scarabs damage. And then the ult, in my opinion, is not really worth leveling until last. You get a movement speed increase. If you want to, you can maybe put those points in a bit earlier, but the fire rate increase is just not worth 5 points. So I'm focusing on that as the very last thing if the match goes long enough. When it comes to the engages, you can see that when we go in, we can keep enemies locked in for quite a long time, which also makes it easier for us to build stacks in 1v1 situations at least, so we have a higher detonation proc, which is very useful for the overall burst. If you enjoyed this build overview, consider subscribing and clicking the bell for more Deadlock content, and again, you can look this build up in the search function if you want to try it out. Give it a heart and it'll be in your own builds. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.